What we know that when a well-provisioned Ukrainian force meets a Russian force on the battlefield, the Ukrainian force prevails, strategically defeating Russia in the north, 2 times operationally defeating Russia in the south, and now turning the tide and tactically defeating Russia vicinity Bakhmut. And so if the West adopts a policy to give Ukraine what it needs to win, Ukraine will win. How this war ends depends entirely on the West and U.S. leadership of the West. If we give them what they need, we will not have a stalemate. Ukraine will prevail over Russia, and Russia will be expelled from Ukraine. If we do not give them what they need, then time is not on Ukraine's side. We all recognize that the war was pushing pretty hard going into the quote unquote winter season last fall and early winter. And the winter in Ukraine is characterized by a muddy period, then a hard frozen period, and then another muddy period, and then drying into the spring months. And so we are in that backside of winter. We're in a pretty muddy period. We have not got to the drying yet. And so a lot of the combat is dominated by the impassability of much of the landscape due to the mud, especially for large combat vehicles. So while I don't like to call it the winter season, we have come through a weather period that changed the way the fight has proceeded. Before the winter, we all remember that Russia suffered 2 strategic defeats in the north of Kyiv, north and northwest of Kharkiv, and those were major defeats for the Russian army. And then approaching into the winter, there was an operational size fight going on in the south near the vicinity of Kherson. And Russia was retreated back across the river, and was digging in World War I fashion along the east side of the river. And then the weather really set in. During that time, in the northern part of the Donbass, several fights broke out, which have now centered, as you mentioned, on Bakhmut. And Bakhmut was a relatively small town, and one would wonder why it's so important to the Russians and also important to the Ukrainians. Tactically, there are some crossroads in there that owning Bakhmut would allow whichever side to control the flow along those north-south or northeast-southwest roads in that vicinity. But I think as important as anything, we saw that the Wagner group, led by Prigozhin, was after Bakhmut. And I think that's important to note, because in Bakhmut is one of the largest salt mines in Europe. And we have to remember that from Putin all the way down to Prigozhin, these are first and foremost kleptocrats who are interested in how they're going to extract money from this whole business. And I believe because Mr. Prigozhin already owns one salt mine in Europe, he was pushing really hard to get this large salt mine in Bakhmut. I would define victory the way that the Ukrainian people are defining victory. Somewhere between the mid 80%, 85, 86%, up to about 92% in some polls. The Ukrainian people define victory as all of Russia out of all of Ukraine.